Now all of us are excited to see how does it actually work in a practical tool.
No pressure.
So the Chromogen tool in the new FilmLight version, I applied it here to already a set of images from a feature film that I graded a few years ago. And what I prepared here so far is not apply anything in the Chromogen tool. I just applied a basic white balance and exposure correction. So I can show that, for example, here, so that the shot came in a little bit bluish. And for that look depth, we don't try to bias the look towards like a white balance mismatch situation on of the scene. So what I'm trying to do there is just to balance the shots in general to a neutral starting point, but I'm not doing any contrast changes or other kind of complex grading. Basically just exposure and white balance corrections to get everything to a neutral level, because our look that we're going to develop for a specific show, so that's what I'm simulating here today, that we would say, okay, so what if we need to develop a look now for that project here, is not biased or then overfitted to a certain white balance mismatch. It should work on all natural, neutral shots. And in the final grading, we will then do something similar. We will first adjust exposure and white balance, of course. Okay, so that's about the setup. And also this is a setup that we would generally recommend for a look depth session like that, to put in a selected set of scenes from the project. And what we additionally recommend, what I don't have here today, is to add another, maybe a small set of test images that you know pretty well, or that contain maybe some more difficult or extreme cases. So the more things you put in to test the look against, the more robust and generic it will be. But in the end, you want to really focus it on the current project and make these, or you should prioritize the footage from the project that we're going to work on. And okay, so in the Chromogen, when we insert the tool, we start with the page like that shows us a lot of presets that we built into it. And so that's one of the ways you can use the tool, is you can apply one of these preset looks to it, and then actually under the hood we then applied a whole set of small stages to the image. But that's not what we want to do today. But I also see that as a very typical use case. You apply a preset, and then you just go in and say, what could we do here? We could then say, okay, I'm not so happy with the yellow brightness. That should be a little bit brighter. But in our case, we want to start building a look from scratch. So I'm skipping the presets and now starting with a clean slate. And the Chromogen tool consists of 10 sub-tools. We call them stages, in that case, that are made for look development. We have the first 4 here, the color saturation, color crosstalk, highlight, bleach, and contrast boost. And these 4 we consider really essential for almost every look that we're building. And then we have brilliance reduction and neutral tint that we also think are very general, but not necessarily required for every look. And then we have 4 sector tools, which are then focused more on a certain color sector. So that is then only half of the color space or color palette. So basically the first 4 are more broader strokes, and this is then already going a little bit more to finer brush strokes. Because what we want to do in the work is we start at a very macro level, and then we go step by step more from the macro to the micro level. But then at one point it stops for the look, because then continuing then grading individual shots, this is then when we go very, very more into the micro level in the post-production. So the first operator I want to show is the color saturation. So here I have these sliders, and I can move them over, and hopefully you can see it makes the image look more colorful and more saturated, or also desaturated if I go the opposite direction. Also, we should maybe have a quick look at the bottom, what we can see here. So on the right side, we always see representation or visualization of the current used operation. In that case, color saturation shows us a top view onto that opponent color space. I guess it's a cardinal color space. So here, if I increase or decrease the saturation, we can see, so this is basically just a scaling up or down in these two dimensions. And here on the left, we have a 3D representation of that. So if I would put it like this, so now it would be almost the same as this one, if you're looking from the top, because here we have the added luminance or brightness component here in that axis. And the right side always only shows us the effect of the currently selected stage, and the left side always shows us the net result of the complete look that we built, because we're going to add a lot of these stages. And that's actually also one of the secrets of the Chromogen tool. Each tool by itself is actually quite simple. We can also see here the color saturation tool does not have too many sliders, but the complexity of the look then emerges out of the combination of a lot of these simple tools with each other. I guess Daniele once called it complexity through numerosity. So we're adding a lot of simple things, and out of that emerges something very complex. But that's also good for us working with it. We don't want overly complex tools. We want to have simple things to work with. Okay. So, so far the color saturation tool does not seem like, I would say, groundbreakingly revolutionary, but let's have a look at it in another color space, because this now here represents the internal working color space of the Chromogen tool, which we call EAB. That's a space that we developed for scene referred grading in an opponent space. But we can also have a look at that operation here just for educational purposes in an RGB cube, so if you're familiar with that. So now we're seeing it in an RGB color space where the luminance is basically the diagonal that I try to put now here in on the y-axis, and the colors are the sides of the cube. And so now if I'm adding saturation with our Chromogen saturation tool, we can see it's a very complex operation in RGB that we're experiencing here. And also if I'm desaturating in that space, we can also almost see that potato shape that Daniele showed a few minutes before. If we sander off here the harsh corners, we can see that the desaturation also brings us naturally to that shape or very close to it. So that should illustrate that it already has not a typical RGB saturation feeling. It already has a what we call more natural feeling to the image. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to ungang these two X and Y axes. So one here is the green magenta axis. So I can increase the saturation only in that dimension or decrease it. And the other one is the, let's call it the blue-yellow axis. And so that's already a nice thing to have. So because Daniele already mentioned, we really like a nice saturation across the blue-yellow, blue-orange axis, but green magenta, especially when we are hitting skin tones, we're very sensitive, and that's always the tough shots for when there is one of the, if the FilmLight has a green or magenta spill in it and everything, that's always hard to grade. And so, but also as a general preference, we often like a stronger amplification of that blue yellow against the green magenta. We can even rotate the space in that also. So if I'm now doing it a little bit harder here, we can see, you should be able to see down here that we can then decide, okay, which specific color do we want to stretch out. Okay, so what are we going to do here? Yeah, so we're adding, so I'm now adding a lot of saturation. You will also see in a few moments why I'm doing that, but maybe a little bit less for the green magenta. But now we're really at an oversaturated stage here. And the next thing, but then we see the effect of the other sliders better. That's why I'm doing it now. So the next thing we can decide about the saturation is where do we want to put or reduce it more in the highlights. So we can basically add more saturation to the highlights, or in that case, we can see that, yeah, the added saturation is now not added to the shadows. It pulls it out. Or what we typically, if we add saturation, what we typically prefer is we're adding it only to the, or mostly to the shadows. And of course with a smooth roll-off with one of these natural functions that Daniele described. Then we have a pivot here, so we can decide, okay, at which point in relation to middle grade do we want that tool to kick in. But in the end, adding more saturation mostly to the shadows is generally a good idea. And for me personally, the the coolest slider in the saturation tool is the chroma slider. With this slider, we can focus the saturation more on just the saturated colors here on the left side, where the colors are more saturated. So that means only add saturation to already saturated colors. That's what I'm doing now. Or the opposite way, which makes more sense for adding saturation, only add the saturation for the colors that aren't that saturated. And that's a typical task that I personally, as a colorist, already thought about for 10 years and always thinking, why can't I have a tool that adds the saturation more to the desaturated colors? And I mean, it's not so trivial to build. Also took us a few years, as you saw, but it's really cool to have that. Because what I personally, as a colorist, always typically are looking for when I think about the color volume cloud on the scopes, like on a chromaticity plot like this, or the typical vector scope, I personally was always looking for to have it as big as possible. I always wanted to have that really filled up circle, but without the extremes spiking out, because they are then always disturbing. So we want it to be as large as possible, but really nicely centered off on the side. So I'm always more thinking in these graphical ways. And this is exactly what we can achieve here. So this is the first part here, now adding the saturation only in the center. So we can see that we can add a nice amount of saturation. So now let's also see a before after on that image here. But it's not really oversaturating the backpack here with the pink colors. Or let's have a look here. So I would say it's already a big improvement on these images, just seeing this amount of saturation added without overshooting too much. But still, on top of that, I would add another color saturation step. And I'm doing that as the very first step in our Chromogen stack. Also, the Chromogen stack, like everything in FilmLight, there is that always that waterfall analogy, so it always flows from top to bottom. So we apply first that stage here, then this one, and then the color crosstalk is currently bypassed. So what I'm doing as the very first step is that centering of the spikes of our color volume. So I'm desaturating the image, maybe not 100%, but quite a lot. And now I'm saying, but only for the very saturated colors. So now you can also have a look here at our point cloud on the scope. You can see it just pulls in these extreme colors that might be disturbing later in the actual grading, or then might draw too much attention from the people watching that. So on many shots, this will not have a strong effect. So we can see it's here. It's just pulling in these extremes. But in general, that's always a good step. And just combining these two saturation stages now brought us already to a very good starting point, I think. Sometimes if you want something very clean and not too filmic, that might already be enough for a project where people are just looking for a vibrant and colorful palette. But let's move on. So there's the color crosstalk operator already here in there, so I'm now activating it. And the color crosstalk is something also that we saw in the human visual perception, that the eyes perceive the colors in an LMS-ish space, but then the images are not transferred into the brain in that LMS-ish space, but in that opponent space. So we're then doing, like, I imagine, like 3 wires going then there. But if there's a very strong signal in one of the wires, it will then also spill into the other signals, because these are not electrical wires with like proper human engineered isolation. These are just organic, this is organic tissue. And so if there's a really strong signal in one of the wires, it will then crosstalk also into the other wires. And that color crosstalk in the opponent space we can simulate with that tool here. And so now we will see what it does. So basically, if I'm now, so here I can control the yellow to RG axis crosstalk and blue to RG at the same time. And what you can see is it's applying these tilt and shift effects to the color space. And also what we should notice, if I turn this a little bit here, is that this is also luminance dependent. So you can see as a net result, it's getting stronger with brighter signals there. And what this is helping us is also shape a little bit the color palette. And I would say that's one of the more abstract tools where you need to build as a colorist a little bit of an intuition for it. But as a general guideline, I would say add a little bit of crosstalk, at least in the bottom row here is usually a nice thing to do, because what you can also see here on the chromaticity plot is, so there we have that thermal locus line that Daniela also showed us before. And if we're cross-talking here, you can see there we're building a little bit of a bias also onto that blue-yellow thermal locus axis. And then we can add, so typically, so that's my procedure, usually adding these two here in a ganged state, but then we can also go into each of these sliders here unganged, and then, so now you can see it's getting more precise. So now I can go in here and we see that. So this slider here is affecting more the green tones, so I should definitely go to a shot that has also more greens in it, and I put them to here more to the beginning of the of my test shots. So here's a shot that has some greens, so now we can see, okay, how does it affect the color of the greens? And so maybe I think, okay, so let's do maybe here a little bit of a negative crosstalk to have the greens a little bit more yellowish. And this slider here, we can see, okay, that really focuses more on the magenta red colors. So I should then maybe go to a shot where I have maybe a lot of skin tones and also something red. Yeah, so yeah, maybe let's go to this one here. So now we can see, okay, so we have that effect on the red. So these are really broad brush strokes, but the general principle is do as much as possible with these very broad tools, and then we can do some fine tuning in the next stages. So I'm always a fan of a little bit more reddish skin tones, not so yellowish, but that's all, of course, a personal preference, and also always depends on the content and on the set design, etc. So maybe I'll leave it like that for now in the color crosstalk, because we have a lot of other things. Next thing I'm going to add is the contrast boost. So this is a tool where we add contrast to the shot, and I personally think this is the best contrast tool that we ever built so far in FilmLight. As I raised the contrast boost value here, and you can see, as expected, it adds contrast. Not a big surprise, but if you ever worked in an HDR project, I mean, we can't show that here on the projector today, you know that adding with a usual contrast tool, contrast to an image is usually very difficult in HDR, because the highlights are usually affected the strongest. If they're already bright, they're overshooting very quickly, and then you need to constantly fight against that, because we want to have the contrast here more in the midtones, especially on the faces, to get that more three-dimensional effect on the image and to add some depth and perceived sharpness to the image, because sharpness is also a function of, especially of contrast. So I hope you can see that it adds a nice layer of depth, and also we realize that's what most of the film looks are also doing, is adding that little bit of a contrast boost. But in that case, as you can see here, so how do we read that plot? The green line is the unity of the tool. So this is where, if we do nothing, we have the green line, and if we're just raising the contrast boost, we can see here in the midtones, we're making the curve more steep, and more steep means more contrast. But at the same time, we're rolling it off in the highlights. And I just encourage you, if you're playing with the new FilmLight version with the Chromogen tool, just pop up a shot on an HDR monitor and then add that contrast. You will hopefully see, as I did, it just works. And typically, I'm not tweaking here the other parameters of the contrast boost. So we have the possibility here to adjust basically the gray pivot, and also that highlight pivot, how strong we want to pull down the highlights, but I think the presets work pretty well. Another thing that I always wished for, so that's the slider that I'm sometimes touching, is that a chroma slider. So typically there are the two extremes with adding contrast. So either you're adding it in RGB, that's what, for example, if you're a FilmLight user, that's what the film grade contrast is doing. But then when you add contrast, you all know that then you're also changing the saturation. If you add contrast, you add more saturation. At the same time, also there's some hue shifts happening. Then there's the other school, that's the base grade contrast. There, we're not changing the chromaticity at all, and but that can also feel a little bit unnatural. So if you reduce the contrast, the picture might look oversaturated. And in the end, here we have a slider for that. So we can have basically the base grade school here is on the left. So basically you can see the chromaticity here stays untouched. So if you want to have more like a bleach bypass, silvery, high contrast look, I would go more into that direction. And here we have the film grade RGB school more on the other side. So now you can see when I add contrast, it also adds more saturation at the same time. And I can just tell as a personal anecdote, so this was a topic I discussed with Daniele for years, and I always came back to it and said, but what about the contrast? And so I'm not so really happy with our extremes. And in the end, what we realized is when we built the tool is that going exactly in the middle, so splitting the difference, like always in color grading, is the best solution. So our preset here is Chroma on 0.5. And since we have that, I have to say I did not touch it that often anymore. So I'm finally now shutting up and Daniele can focus on other things. Okay, so I think we have a nice amount of contrast added here. Of course, if you have really high contrast scenes here, I guess I have a shot here at the beginning. For this one, it might be a little bit too much, but this I would say is an outlier here because here the scene contrast is quite high. And so we will probably in the grading then on a per shot grading maybe then reduce the contrast of that single shot. But as an overall theme on most of the shots, I think it's a nice, it's doing a nice effect. Okay, the next thing is the highlight bleaching. That's a tool that I personally severely underestimated because I thought like, yeah, man, it's a desaturation in the highlights, so been there, done that. But Daniele really made me completely rethink that approach with the tool that he and our other colleagues built here. Because the highlight bleaching, I also realized only a little bit later in the game, is a really essential component of filmic looks or aesthetic looks, etc. So first I'm raising the sliders here, and so we can see that now they're all ganged. So basically, if I'm increasing the highlight bleach, and we can also see that here in the sliders, left is colorful, right is white. So basically we're desaturating the highlights. So hopefully you can see that here, for example, on the background. And yeah, so far so good. And we have a pivot here. So where should that process start? And I think personally, I always like if it starts quite low and then has a very smooth kick in and not doing anything, and then suddenly just at the end kick in quite harsh because then it might look weird on certain shots. So I'm always a fan of starting early with these roll-off processes. So in that case, we're starting 2 stops below middle gray and then going higher and higher. And this looks especially good, for example, when we have skin tones going into higher exposure values. Yeah, maybe here he gets a rim light there, and so we can see it's often helping with making this look much better. I mean, now I'm again overdoing it, so now we would say it's a little bit too grayish. But on the other side, here at the end, I think I have a couple of shots. Yeah, with, for example, some skies in them, but now we also realize, okay, so now we're also losing the blue of the sky, so now you can barely distinguish here the clouds from the blue sky, which is a pity. And that's something where I was always unhappy with the print emulations. I was also always super loyal to my secret printlets, as Daniele described. But one thing I was never happy with is it was really hard through a printlet to have a nice blue sky in it. Basically, I always had to work really hard, lower the luminance, and push in so much blue digitally that it almost fell apart, and then it was not looking that great. But now in the Chromogen, this is one of the steps where I personally am really happy with. We can basically go in here and say, okay, let's do a little bit less bleaching here in the blues, maybe. So then we're just having an easier time with the blue skies. Also, we should probably see it here. So if I'm on the same level as the other ones, we have a more grayish sky, and if I just relax it here in that axis, that's something that's not too bad. And it just means we have to do less gymnastics later, maybe overstretching the image to somehow fight against the desaturation there in the bleaching of the look. And another thing we might want to do is maybe bleach a little bit less for the yellows, so then we keep a little bit of the skin color in, but also maybe in general we're a little bit bleaching too much, so I'm taking it a little bit down. So what is it doing now? Yeah, but I think it really helps here. For example, you can see on the red on the forearm there, for example. That's why it's generally a good idea first with adding a lot of saturation at the top of the Chromogen stack, at least from my personal experience, and because then we're slowly, step by step, shaping off the things that we don't like. But it's always a good foundation to first throw the colors in and then, yeah, shape them off bit by bit. One thing that we are maybe not happy with is, so now that we added that highlight bleach, maybe we think, yeah, but it's now getting maybe too grayish there in the highlights, and so we like maybe that warmth a little bit. What we might want to do is maybe we want to not bleach towards the neutral axis. Maybe we want to bleach more towards maybe a little bit more warmish color. So we want to reduce the color variation there in the highlights, but not to a boring gray, but more maybe to a nice warm orange-ish tone. And this is what we can do with. Now I go to the 2 optional stages that we have in Chromogen. That's a neutral tint. So these 2 ones, just as a recap, these are the ones where we say you don't have to do it every time, but can be essential for certain looks. And the neutral tint, again, is quite simple. And also we always see basically the same parameter space. We always have that chroma slider, the pivot, the fall off, etc. And so here we have, as a primary selector, we can select the hue that we want to add as a tint. And then we have the amount slider, which is a slider that goes into the negative and the positive range. And here from the slider color, you can see that if I'm going here to the right, we're adding the tint to the highlights. And if I'm, and then more and more, the further I go, and if I move the slider to the left, also hopefully we can see that here on the 3D plot, you can see, so now I'm adding the tint to the shadows. And so in that case, we want to add the tint to the highlights. And first I'm doing it really, really strong because I want to fine tune first the hue. So that's how I typically do that. And so then I say, okay, so yeah, maybe just adding a little bit, then it might really work well with the bleaching. And this is one of the points where the order of operations has a really big impact, because here it really makes a difference if you're first tinting and then bleaching, because then the bleach will be still towards the neutral axis. Then in that case we will then maybe just tint it first, but then still shape it off with the bleach towards neutral. In that case, I'm bleaching first, and then taking the result of the bleach and moving that one over. So now we're really more shifting the our highlight color as a global thing. And that's also what we should see here. If I'm adding more and more of the amount here, you can see that our cloud or our tower here is then shifting more to the side. But also what we generally don't want to do is, if something is really, really strongly orange already, we don't want to shift it that much, because maybe we are then pushing it outside of our display gamut, because there's no concept of a display built into the tool. So the Chromogen tool does not know what Rec 7 or 9 or P3 or these gamuts are, because these are artificial systems that we built, or that the humans engineered. And so it's easily possible to basically overshoot over the display gamut. And to avoid that, we can use a little bit of chroma here. So we can say only tint the not so saturated colors, and then slowly fade off the effect for the more saturated colors. So that's also already built into the preset, and that's working quite well. I mean, it's not too creative, but let's add another neutral tint, or maybe I should now start also to name my stages. High recommendation from my side, if you start working with Chromogen, always name your special stages. I mean, these ones here are quite trivial to understand if I will reopen that look in 2 months, but still it can sometimes help. So I would now say warm highs here, and now being super creative, cold lows. And let's add a little bit of complementary color here to the shadows. So I'm first doing it really strong. Also, what I personally always like is to have a strong overlap between processes. In that case, the tints. So maybe here, starting with the warm tint for the highlights quite low, and starting with the cold tint for the shadows above that, so that there's basically that overlap of the 2 smooth things. I think that's usually what works quite well. So now we need to pick our cold color, maybe something like that, and then do it much more subtle, of course. But I think this also then adds like a nice separation here in the shadows. And you can see then often these are then very small and subtle things for an individual image, but then if we add all of them up, it's then really helping. Or here we can also, I think, see that, yeah, it adds a little bit of depth. Maybe let's fine-tune the color here a little bit. Okay, so how does it look so far? So that's now, I'm just now toggling with and without the look that we built so far on the images. This is how it looks. Okay. So this one is, I guess, shot through a polarizer, so that sky is a little bit dark. But that's also then something that we will probably then need to fix in the grade. But because that sky here is actually quite bright, so I could go in and say, let's do the blues brighter, but then we would also lose that sky here even more. So I think there's always that stuff that we're going to do in the grade and that are not part of look dev. Yeah. But I think in general we are going into a good direction. So the next thing to do is, I mean, there's a few topics that we can cover, but one very important one I would say is now doing a special treatment for the skin tones. I mean, Daniele talked about how it's often something preferred to reduce the color variation in flesh tones. And of course, we also have a tool for that. And so now we're going into these sector tools. And they are all working on a specific sector and doing a color sector of the color space, and they're doing different things. Like one can change the brightness of colors, saturation. We can skew them. That's basically, let's say, shifting the hues, and we can squash them. And the squash is now the one that I want to show, because there it's easiest to explain what it's doing visually. And also what I would now do is I would now put all these sector tools more upstream of my highlight bleach. So I want to do all these sector operations before I'm bleaching off the colors, where I still have all of the scene referred color volume available. So as a general guideline, I would recommend that. If I'm doing it before or after the contrast boost, I would say it's not really making a difference. But typically, I would do these sector things before my bleaching and then final tinting of the bleached image. So, okay, so what does a sector squash do? So one thing I can do is here just move that squash slider all the way up, and you can see here on the visualization of the tool is it compresses all of the hues in a sector to one specific hue. And if we are now zooming into the skin here, so we can see that basically it reduces the color variation in that area. I mean, here it doesn't look really good. It's maybe a little bit greenish, I would say. And of course, we can select the hue where we want to squash towards to. Or we can also, all of these hue sliders, we can also always use with a picker. So we can go into the image and say, so this is the color that I want to squash towards to. And so now hopefully you can see that this reduces the color variation in that part of the color palette, and it adds that small abstraction layer instantly to the image. One step further away from a news broadcast and one step closer to that maybe epic post-apocalyptic story. Here, and of course we're losing a little bit of saturation in the lips, but I will also talk about that in a moment. But that's maybe not always the thing we want to do. We can also do the opposite. We can also say, okay, so let's do a negative squash. Let's spread out the color details, because that's, I think, sometimes can also be a nice thing to have to, if you have a really great looking actress or actor and with great makeup, then maybe you want to really amplify the fine nuances that they put there with the makeups. It's now amplifying these small nuances. And so, but now in that case, let's go more for a squash. And with the chroma slider, we can now say, okay, so let's squash more towards the not so saturated colors. So if we have strong red lips, then we can focus our squash really more on just the flesh tones and leave or let's go to a shot where we have her red piece of cloth here in the frame. So now the sector squash should not affect that one too much here, because I'm now already raised the chroma slider to say, so for the saturated colors, don't do so much of the squashing. And I guess hopefully you can also see it here on that thing. Or now, if I'm now just moving the squash, how it affects here that bird's eye view on the color space. And that squash can also be used to create really interesting looks. So we also used it in the presets to do things like, we built a look where we, in the shadows, we compressed towards red, green, blue, like the primary additive colors. And then we made a smooth transition. It's for the highlights. We compressed towards cyan, yellow, and not magenta, because everyone always hates magenta. So then we then had that weird transition of hues going along the luminance axis, which also makes interesting effects. And that are not so this is not following any principle, maybe from film necessarily, but just playing with the available parameter space and thinking a little bit outside the box compared to established processes. Okay, so now we have that squash for our skin tones, and so that's a great tool also to work on that. And another thing, if we now go more to the green colors, is that maybe our greens are still a little bit too green for that kind of scenery. So what we could do is we could add a sector skew. So instead of desaturating them, I first want to skew them to a little bit different color. Or actually, I should also, being a good role model, I should label my stages here skin squash. And so let's say here, bright green skew. We could also label it maybe it's green to yellow, because that's what I want to do. So now I can pick the green here and now squash it more towards a yellow first. Let's do it really strong. And again, maybe let's start with the pivot a little bit lower and focus it basically mostly on the highlights. So now we get a little bit of color variation so that the dark greens are not skewed, but the brighter they get, then they get more yellow. And I mean, that's, I would say, a little bit maybe too radical here, but goes into the right direction, and maybe fine-tune that. And just as a best practice for working, what makes sense is to group the shots so that shots with similar dominant colors in the frame are next to each other. And so here I have, for example, so most of the shots that have a lot of green in it, I have next to each other, because when we're then going into the sector work, it's then always good to check the different shades of green that we have in our project. So now I think it's definitely helping here, skewing a little bit towards yellow. Well, let's add a few more sector things. Actually, that red piece of clothes of the girl is it's basically part of her character. So maybe we want to give a little bit of push to that. So I'm adding a sector saturation thing. Again, putting it somewhere here. And now I say, let's call it dark red boost. And so we're going into the reds. We're increasing the saturation. Let's first overdo it a little bit. And then we say, okay, so mostly boost up the more saturated colors, because I don't want to boost up necessarily the skin tones too much, so it have a stronger effect on the saturated colors, and a little bit effect maybe on the skin tones. And only do it here, only do it in the shadows. And now let's reduce the effect. Like so. Let's zoom in, and hopefully we get, so we get that nice boost. Of course, we can also see collateral effects here on other things that are red, but that's the nature of working like that. And that's also what makes the stuff look natural, not fall apart, because we're not doing these surgical operations. We're doing these very smooth and broad things, and adding lots of them together then gives us a nice final result. And also, hopefully, one thing that you saw is that while playing with all of the different tools, we might had some situations where the image didn't look that great, but we never had a situation where it completely fell apart, or where it looked like digitally overprocessed in a way like that. And yeah, so I think getting there. Just thinking maybe some of the greens. What about this one? Yeah, I think to get a little bit more richness in the picture, maybe we can darken these greens. I have the feeling that they look a little bit grayish, but I don't want to oversaturate them. So I would add a sector brightness. let's call it greens darker. Pick our hue and pull down the brightness. That's, oh no, actually, I think we can focus it maybe a little bit more towards the highlights. Maybe let's fine tune a little bit the color here. And then relax it a bit. So I think hopefully here on these opening shots with lots of foliage, it's now, having a nice effect. I mean, maybe in that case, now I'm thinking the green is a little bit oversaturated, so I'm adding another sector saturation there. And I guess after that's the last sector to add for today. I'm picking the green, desaturating, mostly in the shadows, I would say in that case. At least it looks to me more stranger in the shadows. And maybe also more focused towards this more saturated colors. Yeah. And what I'm typically also then doing as a very last step is adding another color saturation here at the bottom and just again shaping off a little bit the extremes of what we did so far. So I'm doing basically the same thing that I did here in the beginning, desaturating, but only the saturated colors. And you can again see here on the scope how it pulls in these very extreme colors, and I think that's always then having a nice effect. And on many shots it does not have a big impact, but helping them on the extreme shots. Okay, that's the look that we built now, and I want to give you two pieces of advice. So one is, so far I never showed it on that shot here, on that night shot. And so there I would say, and this is also the experience that I made with using the tool on real projects, is there's then always these scenes where the look that we built is not fitting perfectly. For example, here I would say that night scene now looks really oversaturated to me. And in the old days when we had a show look baked into a LUT, we then always basically had the two options. First, we try to somehow work around the LUT, then maybe keying back something from not processed by the LUT into the image, or somehow shaping the image prior to the LUT in an unnatural way so that it then flows through better. Or the other thing is that in very extreme cases, I also had to do that sometimes, then throwing away the show look LUT and then doing the night scenes without it at all. But then it's really hard to make your scene fit into your movie and fit into the world that we created with the color palette. And what I realized is in all of the projects that I did so far with the Chromogen is I had at least one scene, usually even two or three in the movie, where I then went in and just did a tweak of the look that we built. So here we could go in and say, maybe let's don't do the dark red saturation boost, and maybe we don't add so much here of the color saturation. So I don't want to, I mean, we would then just reduce it here for that particular scene. And then we still have basically the color rules of our world that we established apply to the image, but just maybe not in such a super strict way. And having that flexibility going in to certain shots, especially night shots, or I had in another project, I had a nightclub with some neon lights. It's really great having for these specific scenes. In my cases, these were mostly night scenes and or nightclub or something. But in one case also there was another scene where just the set design and the colors that we had in the frame did not really play well with the look, and from that specific location, then we tweaked it. Or here we have an example. For example, we have here that scene with the torches in a cave, where it's really great to have the flexibility to go in and tweak the look. And another point I want to make in that regard is what I also realized is that the look dev is for me never really finished. So I mean, you're doing that look dev session ideally before the shooting, and then you're baking it out as a LUT for use in camera and for the dailies probably. But then when you go into the final grading, or if the final colorist is also doing the dailies, it's then great to step by step, in minimal steps, evolve the look even further. Because the more images you see with your look, you're then realizing, I'm realizing on every shot, almost every shot, I'm doing the same grading tweak. And if I'm doing that then for a while, then I'm thinking, maybe I should improve the look a little bit into that direction, because maybe that's really what is still missing. So what I realized is I constantly updated the look almost until the last moments. I mean, in very small steps, of course, so it's not changing it dramatically, but that's also a very nice thing to have. Okay, but now there's one step that is missing, and that's the brilliance reduction. So that's the thing that Daniele showed for these unnaturally saturated colors that are too bright for their saturation. So we have the brilliance reduction stage here. So let's throw that in, and let's move it more up where we still have a lot of saturation. So I would typically do it before the highlight bleaching. So I can now raise the amount to 1, and we can see in that case there's nothing happening, because from the set design of that project we don't have many colors that are basically too saturated for their brightness. I went to the shot here with the backpack, because if we now make the tool a little bit more aggressive, then we will see an effect here probably on the backpack, because no color in these images looks like emitting light to us in a glowy kind of sense. But here with the sliders, I can say, okay, let's focus a little bit more on also even lower saturated colors, and maybe also on a little bit darker colors. Now we can suddenly see an effect here. And so now with the brilliance reduction, we can see we can make these overly saturated colors a bit darker. But for that project here, I think it would not be as crucial. That's probably also why I forgot it, because I had no visual clue reminding me of it. But I think it's still not a bad idea to have a little bit of brilliance reduction then built into the look. All right, yeah. So I think that finishes this look that we built here. I can also show you one that I did here in preparation for the session. Yeah, so I would say it's a little bit more abstract than what we did here now just live, but also not dramatically different. But here in the beginning, I built one that, just as another extreme example, I built one where I did something a little bit unconventional. So there I took the color saturation and I desaturated a lot, but mostly the desaturated colors. So I wanted to create that gray world. So basically everything that is not very saturated gets gray and colorless, and only the saturated colors remain. And so that's also something, I mean, I would not necessarily do it, but just to give you some more ideas to think about what is all possible with the tool. And so that's something that I did here. So I made it first gray, then added some tints to that gray axis to make it even a little bit colder, etc. Okay, I think we have maybe 5 minutes for questions. And thank you for listening.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. It was great. Also showing that the brilliance reduction doesn't do anything if there are no brilliant colors is actually a good thing, because you can have it in the look, but it does only operate if you have those colors in the frame. Are there any questions?
Hello, thank you for this interesting class. I have a little question. Even though it's very, very basic, I'm quite sorry. But since you have a sequence of a film and you are coloring, I suppose, every image separately, no presets and nothing like this. So how do you keep the sequence coherent? If you're using some color palettes or some similar settings in every image?
I think that's exactly the point, to keep it coherent, that this becomes part of every shot. So that look you build is applied to every shot, and so every shot in a sequence gets the same characteristics, and that actually glues the scene and then the movie together.
So you can apply the same settings or...
Oh, that's the point. Yeah, the point is that this look is then applied to a whole scene.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So basically, we're treating everything through the look to basically apply I call it the color rules of the world that we're creating.
And if you tweak it, if you say, I think this, you're pointing out what Andy said, if you then later tweak it, you tweak it for a whole scene, and so that it becomes always a coherent.
That's all.
Sequence. Yeah, no, all good.
No, good. And also, that's also one point that I didn't mention, or I think maybe I forgot to mention, is that these are really, we see them as look development tools. We don't think that people will necessarily change them or should not change them on a shot-by-shot basis, so more on a scene-by-scene basis, or maybe use the same setting for the whole movie or whole project. And so these are not grading tools. So grading is making then the individual shot fit into the scene. And this is a different level. This is the look dev stage. So these are not grading tools, but look dev tools. Yeah.
There was another question over there. So
I was wondering, is this all happening in linear, and then afterwards you can adapt it to log or to a gamma referred space?
The Chromogen is color space aware. That means whatever your input or working color space is, it will always convert from that space into its internal representation, and it's an opponency color space, so it's neither a linear nor log space, and then it will convert back to where it comes from. So you can apply then the same look to all of your workflows and also camera material. So it's agnostic of the color workflow and the input and output color space.
To put it in simpler terms, it's a scene referred tool, so you can imagine it as going from scene linear to scene linear with a look, but not clamping anything anywhere. So it's not adding the conversion to Rec 709 or something.
So you can put out a linear show LUT for VFX as well.
Yes,
of course. Yeah.
So it's all formula based in the end of the day, and you can, for preview purpose, make it scene referred to scene referred, or combine it with a LUT or with a DRT to. Yeah.
For me, it makes a really big difference that I know that the image that we're currently seeing on the screen is not touched by any 3D LUT anywhere. So there's no interpolation errors anywhere. So this is all processed just through formulas in floating point. You cannot usually show it directly on images or pinpoint it to a certain thing, but it just gives a very good feeling about the image quality also. Yeah. I think there was another one.
Well, thank you. I would like to know if you will use Chromogen in the color grading session, or maybe just for the look development. And also, I saw that you separate a lot the saturation, and saturation it's a bit destructive generally. It's the most destructive operation, I think. Maybe I am wrong, I don't know. But you start putting a lot of saturation, and we, as cinematographers, never be sure how much can we take off or take in saturation. So I see that you separate green a lot from magenta, so how is the limit? Maybe it's a question. Until you destruct your saturation.
So maybe I can answer the second one, and you maybe the first one about.
The first one was how do you, if you use it in a grading session. Yeah, so I think I see, that's what I outlined already in the beginning. I see two major scenarios. One is you do a proper look dev session, then you're maybe building it like I did today from scratch, and then really spending also the time. And I mean, now we had like 45 minutes today, but I would say it takes at least half a day to really flesh out a look for a new show. And hopefully you're paid for that, but that's also something that needs to be organized with the production, of course, and scheduled, etc. Or the colorists maybe just prepare it before the final grading starts. And the other scenario is you need a look quickly. Then you start probably with one of the presets and then just go in and say, yeah, okay, that preset is great. It's built after a certain film stock, for example. We have some presets in there, and then you say, but maybe just the yellows I want to have a little bit different for that project. So both is possible. And then what I really realized is that in either case, you then will, for long-form projects, come to certain scenes where you then go in and do some small tweaks, but then typically only then for the whole scene, maybe the whole night scene or the whole scene at a certain location, adjusting it in a small way.
And about breaking up the and fearing image tearing, I hope you have seen that you can move the sliders in very fast directions and add a lot of operations, and the image doesn't break. And that comes back to the design of the algorithms, because every stage is a smooth operation, and if you add a smooth operation onto a smooth operation, the resulting operation is a smooth operation. Whereas if you have a non-smooth operation, only one will make the final look not smooth. So it's very easy to break a look by doing something that one thing that breaks continuity, and therefore the design is so it feels limiting. Maybe you see that you can do it to the shadows, but you don't have like a Bezier curves where we can say like how steep, because this is actually the point in this look development thing, that you never can produce, or you need to do like really crazy stuff to actually make such a steep transform that it actually tears image data apart. So it's really, the parameter space is very inviting for exploration, because it never tries to break the image.
So if someone has a very urgent one, maybe a very last one, and then we wrap it up.
So there's one over there, I think. Steffen has a...
So just to wrap it up, the stages all add like individual transforms to the tool?
Yeah.
Or do they result in like one transformation that you then apply?
That it's basically technically the different transforms are stitched into one transform. Yeah. So, but it's a technical implementation which increases the processing speed. So we only upload the image once to the GPU, and all of those different stages become one stage on the GPU. But it runs through the individual formulas. But there's a lot of optimization you can do when you have two color saturation things and going on. So that's why you can add 50 stages and still have it in real time, because once it's on the GPU, it's basically for free. Nowadays, the GPUs are so fast. But it's not baked into a lookup table or something like that. It's processed in 32-bit.
Yeah, so it really makes a difference that you still have it all. If you're applying it through the Chromogen operator, it's always processed in floating point as formulas.
Yes,
and so it's not reducing it to a 3D LUT internally. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.